Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Wong and I am pretty much a professional mythbuster. Today I'm going to be talking about what I've learned over the last 10 or so years of busting sunscreen myths online. My formal education is in chemistry and my professional background is mostly in science education. I'm the founder of Lab Muffin Beauty Science, where I've been explaining the science behind cosmetics and personal care products for a general audience on my blog, social media, and YouTube channel over the last 10 years. I talk about all sorts of topics related to cosmetics, but sunscreen, and particularly sunscreen myths, is probably my main topic. People ask me questions about sunscreen all the time, and it's about half of my most popular videos on YouTube. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the things I've learned over the years about where sunscreen myths come from, how to effectively bust them, and why we should care about myths. Now, I'm going to be really annoying and start with the last question because I kind of need you to be on board with that so you'll listen to what I say about the other two questions. So, why do we need to care about myths? We're going to start with this common myth, which is that chemical or organic sunscreens work only by absorbing UV and converting it to heat, while physical or inorganic sunscreens work only by reflecting UV. So you might think, this myth is fine. It's really just a technicality. Why should we even care that consumers don't know the nitty-gritty science behind how sunscreens work? So here's the problem. People are actually quite smart and curious. They will draw connections and apply the information they've learned to new situations. So if people are starting off with the wrong initial piece of information, then it has children and grandchildren. And I'm sure if we really tried, we could probably think of some great grandchildren as well. So now, not only do consumers think that chemical and physical sunscreens work differently, they also think that they need to apply and reapply them differently, and that they should ignore the SPF and just look for zinc oxide, and that physical sunscreens alone, well, zinc oxide alone, protects against visible light. And then now consumers are insisting that you give them zinc-only sunscreens that work for all skin tones and feel really nice. Plus, they need to be SPF 100 because everyone knows that zinc oxide is really effective. They also need to protect against melasma, and they'll get angry at you if they burned because they didn't reapply for 10 hours because everyone knows physical sunscreens don't need to be reapplied. And the starting point for all of this is a pretty abstract myth. There are lots of other myths that directly impact consumer behavior. So, for example, general chemical fearmongering is a big problem in the cosmetics industry, and it's one of the reasons that people are just avoiding wearing sunscreens. This survey was done in Australia, which has one of the highest rates of skin cancer in the world. So, where are all of these myths coming from? I mentioned that people like to fill in the blanks when they're given incomplete information. But why are there so many sunscreen myths in particular? I think there are two big reasons for this. Firstly, there is quite a lot in the literature about sunscreen, or at least there's a lot compared to other cosmetic products. It's regulated as a drug in some places, and it's an anti-cancer product. So, as all the researchers in the audience know, the word cancer makes it a lot easier to get research funding. That means that there's a lot more publicly available studies and data, which should be a good thing. But it also means that there is a lot more highly technical, incomplete information for people to misinterpret. And us scientists are partly to blame because we tend to emphasize how important peer-reviewed studies are. But we often don't talk about their issues, so people who don't have a research background often go straight to the peer-reviewed literature without realizing these problems. And this is not an exhaustive list. There are usually paywalls, so a lot of people can only read the abstract of a paper. A lot of researchers treat the abstract like it's marketing for their paper to try to get people to read the full version. So abstracts tend to purposely leave things out and talk up the importance of their findings. Even if the abstract is completely honest, there is still a word limit. So they really shouldn't be read alone, but people still do read the abstract alone and get conclusions from that because that's all they have. Open access papers are not always, but they are usually a bit lower in quality. A lot of open access papers are sponsored by companies who have a financial interest, and they're trying to use the peer review paper as basically marketing for their products. Predatory journals are also more often open access than higher quality ones. Predatory publishers generally don't have a rigorous peer review process. So, the papers that people can read more easily often have a lot of bad methods and lazy literature reviews. And this also happens a lot in higher quality journals as well, especially for cosmetic chemistry, which isn't really a field that has a ton of academic interest. So the papers really need to be read critically, which isn't exactly easy. Papers are also written for a postgraduate audience specializing in that field. So someone jumping in might misinterpret concepts or even just misunderstand terminology like organic or significant. And of course, they won't be able to critically assess the methods used or the reasoning presented in the paper. The introduction and conclusion sections of papers tend to hype up the research, and they really need to be taken with a grain of salt. They're not rigorous, systematic, or critical reviews, but again, people who aren't used to this tend to take them at face value. These two sections also tend to be the easiest ones to read, so this ease of reading, coupled with the fact that most people are reading them from the lower quality open access papers, you can see how it's really easy for someone to get the wrong idea of what the established science is. There is also the fact that a lot of cosmetic science isn't published in peer-reviewed journals. So there is this idea from lay people and scientists and doctors who don't know much about cosmetics, and this did include me at the start, that there just isn't that much science behind cosmetics, and the stuff that's in the peer-reviewed literature is all of the science that exists. So you might remember a peer-reviewed study that got published last year announcing that avobenzone could be degraded by uncoated zinc oxide, and that this was brand new information. The second reason that there's so many sunscreen myths is that a lot of people care about sunscreen. You can see the exponential growth in Google search volume here over the last 18 years. And I think some of the contributing factors to this is that firstly, the skincare category has been growing exponentially. And sunscreen is unanimously promoted as the most important skincare product, which it is. But it's dermatologists and influencers, and yeah, pretty much everyone's saying this. It's also gotten a lot easier to import grey market products, and Asian sunscreens in particular are both reasonably affordable and really nice to use. On top of this, the Korean government also has a lot of incentives for exporting Korean products. And then, of course, K-pop and Korean culture has gotten a lot more popular as well, which has meant that Korean cosmetics have sort of gotten this ride to the top. There are also a ton of cosmetically elegant Western sunscreens for the face that have come out over the last 3 or 4 years. So people now are actually wearing sunscreen and talking about them instead of just pretending to. So that means we have a topic that's really prone to misunderstandings, and people really want to talk about it. And the correct information isn't easy to access. And so we have the perfect conditions for myths to grow and proliferate. So I guess the million-dollar question is, how do we bust myths effectively? So in my experience, this is a recipe that tends to work quite well. Directly addressing the myth head on. So I'm going to be using a Mario Kart analogy because I'm a millennial. This is like using a red shell that directly hits the myth, which in this analogy is Bowser. I have an example here of an Instagram post busting this myth, which is that chemical sunscreens need to react with skin before they work and start absorbing UV. I had a longer explanation of why this wasn't the case in the caption. Most of my myth posts use this very clear myth-truth format, and it's worked incredibly well because it makes it very easy for people to recognize which myth you're talking about. Plus, it's also really eye-catching. If the myth is really common, then it's quite shocking for people to find out that it is actually a myth. So it sort of acts like honest clickbait. There was a paper that was published a while ago about the so-called backfire effect, which is where they found that if you mention the myth first, it can actually reinforce the myth in people's minds. But later researchers found that this isn't actually a problem if you make sure that it's clear that it's a myth and you explain everything properly afterwards. I've personally found that if I didn't have the myth there and just tried to explain the science on its own, some people would ask me questions in the comments that clearly showed that they didn't realize I was talking about that particular myth. So, yeah, I think signposting is just incredibly important. Then, after that, it's also good to explain why the myth is incorrect. Helping people understand what's going on is, firstly, more convincing than just saying that X is wrong. Plus, it also helps people retain that information later on. The way I approach debunking is I am trying to make the science more appealing and seem more logical than the myth. And this is not always easy, it's often quite challenging because the science is usually more complicated than the myth, and it requires people to go against their cognitive biases a lot of the time. And most people don't actually realize that they have cognitive biases to begin with. What I found really useful is to point out things that people know, things that are really commonly known, that are inconsistent with the myth. So using multiple arguments is also really good if you have multiple arguments in case one fails. It's also good to show rather than just tell. So for this myth where sunscreen needs to react with skin to work, there's a simple demonstration you can do with sunscreen on paper and a UV torch. There's also the fact that you wouldn't be able to measure UV absorption spectra if skin had to be involved. I had a few other arguments as well. I like to approach this sort of debunking like a legal case or a newspaper article with the strongest argument at the start because people do tend to lose focus while reading through the caption. They are on social media after all in their spare time. They're not really there to try to learn and focus. Explaining things is also a bit of a balancing act. You need to go into enough detail to build a good case and help people understand, but at the same time, you don't want to distract people with too many details, and you want people to actually make it to the end of your post. Social media is actually a really good place for experimenting with this sort of thing. The comments can give you pretty immediate feedback on what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, and so how you might want to adjust your messaging in the future. One thing that I think is really useful is preempting common questions and misconceptions that your debunking post might actually bring up. If you don't do this, sometimes you can end up really bogged down in the comments when people ask you the same question a bunch of times. A lot of people might also just try to argue with you in the comments because they get really defensive if you're missing an important aspect. And so if you're like me and you're in a weird time zone and you have to go to bed and you can't monitor the comments, your comment section can actually end up spreading misinformation, which is very much not what we want to do. One thing I do really hate is convenient, quick ways of dismissing a myth that don't really address any underlying concerns that people have. This was actually one of the big reasons I started my blog because I was getting really frustrated with this sort of debunking because it just didn't really seem to help. So I was seeing a lot of this sort of thing. Someone would say, I like natural products because I don't want to put chemicals on my skin. And then some smartass would come along and say, but everything is chemicals. And I think we've all been there. We're all sick of people being scared of chemicals for no good reason, but it doesn't address the real concern, which is people have heard scary things about the specific chemicals in cosmetics, and they're using the word chemicals as shorthand for ingredients that are probably synthetic that I've heard really scary things about. And so after this exchange, our concerned consumer walks away with the same opinion. Plus, on top of that, they now feel like scientists are dismissive and they don't care about their health. So this sort of snappy comeback is a lot easier than trying to explain the science, but it ends up being really counterproductive. And I think that one of the reasons that my content has resonated with so many people is because I really try to deal with the rest of the iceberg under people's statements, even though a lot of the time it isn't that rewarding. So this whole thing is not meant to be a diss of Decium's Everything is Chemicals campaign. I actually really like it because they don't stop at everything is chemicals. They go into lots of detail about it. They explain things like toxicology, hazard versus risk, the fact that regulations exist. So lots of respect to Decium for this campaign. Now, on top of explaining, I think it's also good to try to sort of vaccinate people against other myths, to try to maximize the debunking's impact. So try to cram in more info while the person is still engaged in my post. If you hint at greater complexity, that what you have in your post is just a summary and there is a lot more to it because there's only so many characters you can fit in an Instagram post, I found that that tends to discourage people from taking what you've said and spinning myths out of it. I'm always really paranoid that I'm accidentally creating or contributing to myths because we have enough of them already. But I do think that it's something that's impossible to completely avoid. If there are related myths, you can also mention them a bit as well, and I think that tends to encourage people to look at other things critically too. You can also directly discuss critical thinking and cognitive biases in the post to try to encourage that sort of skeptical mindset. Busting myths in a timely manner is also really important. Every time there's a scary headline, people tend to freak out and they try to find information on it. And so I think it's really good to have something factual for people to share with their friends to counteract all the fears and all the myths and, yeah, just the general hysteria that tends to happen. Also, having a timely debunking can also stop the whole myth family tree thing from happening. Now, as well as just busting the myths directly, I think there's also a bunch of things that can be done to create like a hostile environment for myths to help prevent consumers from falling for myths as easily, so they won't spread the myths as widely. In this Mario Kart analogy, this is like spreading banana peels everywhere so that the myths will slip and fall. One thing that's really important, I think, is making information from experts easily accessible. And this is something that Jen does really well through her EcoWell podcast and what we're doing here at this conference. Now, only the more invested people are going to consume this longer, more detailed information, but then they'll be able to share the correct information to people who will only sit through a 1 minute video. It's like we're influencing the influencers, so sort of like a trickle down effect that actually works. General education on the science of how products work. People are more interested in stuff that's directly relevant to their interests. So if you can link basic scientific concepts to their interests, so in this case, maybe sunscreen, it can help with trying to explain other things later on. There are lots of concepts that come up repeatedly when talking about cosmetics, things like pH, surfactants, and solubility, and I found that people do manage to understand that sort of thing quite well. And again, educating people about cognitive biases and critical thinking is good as well to try to cultivate that skeptical mindset. Now, there are also power ups for myths that make them more difficult to bust and make them more likely to get shared really widely and go viral. So, in my analogy, this is like mushrooms that make the carts accelerate. First off, if a myth taps strongly into basic emotions like fear, anger, and disgust, these sort of reptile emotions that developed early on in human evolution. This tends to shortcut people's ability to pause and reconsider and think critically. Fear is particularly powerful. It's like a golden mushroom power up. For example, finding out that something you use every day might be harming your long term health. People generally have good intentions and they want to share helpful, shocking information to help protect their friends and family. If something is harmful to babies or if it's linked to cancer, these are especially strong emotional triggers for people. If a myth taps into a cognitive bias really well, most myths will play to at least some cognitive biases. If it confirms a belief, like that big corporations are evil or that chemicals with scary names are scary, then people will tend to believe it a lot more easily. Appeal to authority is especially powerful, and I think it's really one of the frustrating things about cosmetic myths. If there's perceived expert support for the myth, it makes it really, really hard to debunk. And in cosmetics, it isn't always clear who the relevant experts are for a particular topic, and there are a lot of experts speaking outside of their scope of expertise incorrectly that people will just believe. On top of that, there are also a lot of experts speaking within the scope of their expertise incorrectly as well. So, for example, I've come across cosmetic formulators saying that there's tons of asbestos in talc. We have clean cosmetic chemists saying that we need to avoid chemical sunscreens and lots of other so called toxic ingredients. I've even come across a board certified dermatologist saying that chemical sunscreens cause birth defects and kidney disease. Personally, I found that people do tend to believe me more quickly now when I say things because I now have that cosmetic chemist qualification, even though getting that qualification didn't actually make me any better at interpreting studies. So, just having that perception of expertise is really powerful. One of the big reasons why this chemical sunscreens absorb UV and physical sunscreens reflect UV myth is so persistent is that the American Academy of Dermatology has it on their website. And again, people don't really understand expertise, they don't really know what dermatologists actually do. There's this perception that dermatologists just sit around all day looking at skincare and they know everything about skincare, even though in reality, most dermatologists probably spend maybe an hour or two of their training actually looking at skincare outside of products that actually treat medical conditions. They don't realize that dermatologists probably know nothing about physical chemistry. They probably don't even realize that this is physical chemistry. So even though Curtis Cole and J&J wrote this article that explicitly debunks this myth, people still believe the dermatology version. And journalists are still asking dermatologists to talk about this, and most of them end up saying what the AED says. I actually worked on a letter to the editor with a dermatologist on this topic. She tried to get an article published in a dermatology journal, and it actually got rejected because they said that this version is correct. Reef Safe sunscreen is another example. There are now quite a few reviews published going through all the evidence on sunscreens and coral reefs, and they found that the risk to reefs from sunscreens is most likely pretty insignificant. But people don't know the difference between a review and a study, and they'll still point to individual studies that have overemphasized their findings, as well as the NOAA website, which has this infographic. One of the top coral scientists has been repeatedly saying in the media that sunscreen is a distraction from the real issues facing reefs, so things like climate change. But the scientist who did the 2016 study that started Reef Safe has also been in the media saying a lot of things like this. In my professional opinion, most of the coral reefs in the last 40 years have died because of your bathroom than anything else, climate change, oil spills, what have you. And even though most of his research these days isn't even on coral, a lot of people will just see this and think there are scientists on both sides have equal amounts of evidence, we don't know anything for sure, it's probably 50-50. Maybe even more depressingly, there's an article published last week by some dermatologists that was specifically on sunscreen misinformation. And it says that the effect of sunscreens on coral is worrying. For this, they cited an open access paper, which was also written by dermatologists. So, what can we do about these superpowered myths? It would be really great if just presenting the facts objectively was effective, but unfortunately, that is just not the reality that we live in. And so sometimes I found that instead of trying to explain cognitive biases or trying to get people to forget that they have emotions or just explain all of how science works, sometimes it's more effective to just show that the myth doesn't work, even within the context of its own logical framework. So, what I mean is, when people are scared of beauty products causing cancer, it's good to directly point out the emotional manipulation, but also the bad things that could happen if they don't use these products. So, for example, if they don't use sunscreen, they can get skin cancer. If they don't use preservatives, they could go blind from using contaminated products. Also, it's good to point out that fear-mongering just has a bad track record. So, for example, the EWG used to promote that the measles vaccine caused autism. So they're putting the trust in the wrong people. Going with the logic when targeting cognitive biases also works. So, for example, pointing out that evil money-grabbing corporations would actually get more money by making safer products is a really good strategy. Or showing that natural things like bananas also have scary-sounding chemicals in them. For dealing with misinformation from experts, I think the most effective thing is to just have more experts giving the correct information. So I think it's important for people with credentials to consider doing more science communication. while also being responsible about what you say. So, especially if it's outside of your field, you want to make sure that you fact check because perceived expertise is just so powerful. People not understanding expertise is also a big issue, so I think it's important to point out who the relevant experts are for a particular topic and also stating what your sources are, whether that's books or articles or other experts. This can help people understand how to deal with information in other situations. It's also important to call out misinformation, especially when it comes from another perceived expert, and especially if it's someone with the same credentials as you. So, for example, if a dermatologist says something incorrect about how birth defects are caused by chemical sunscreens, it's a lot easier for another dermatologist to correct it. A lot more people are going to see that and just accept it at face value, compared to if I came along and tried to explain that dermatologists aren't experts in birth defects and you should believe me over them, even though they're a medical doctor and I'm not, because there are these studies. Or in this case, it's actually even worse because I have to show that no studies exist, and it is really hard to explain to someone without a science background what a lack of studies actually means. So, my key take home messages about sunscreen misinformation. First off, people do have an appetite for learning, and there is a lot of power in science communication. When I started my blog 10 years ago, I always just assumed that it would stay a very niche blog and I would have a very small audience, but clearly the demand was there for accurate, in depth information. At the end of the day, people really just want to be using products that are safe and effective, and a lot of people realize that science is a great tool for helping them get to that. But a lot of the time, people just don't have access to the right information. Also, debunking misinformation can change how consumers act and what consumers ask for, which changes what products end up on the market, and hopefully that changes for the better. To effectively debunk misinformation, you need to be empathetic and really understand why people believe the misinformation. It's a lot easier to debunk things that way. It's a lot more powerful to do it that way because you're really getting to the root cause. Experts have a massive advantage in debunking misinformation because of that perceived expertise. And I think experts from the cosmetics industry should really take a more active role in it. So, thank you to everyone who's agreed to present today. Hopefully, this event will add a lot more correct information about sunscreen and dilute the misinformation, and hopefully make my job a lot easier.